The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed somehow appropriate for the kind of news that changes everything. Margot Chen had been sitting at her kitchen table in her cramped Seattle apartment, nursing cold coffee and scrolling through job listings she had no intention of applying to, when the mailman knocked. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, the kind of paper that felt like it came from another era. Her name was written in elegant script across the front, and there was no return address. Only a postmark from a town she'd never heard of, Greystone Hollow, somewhere deep in the mountains of northern Washington. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. There was something old-fashioned about the whole presentation, something that made her think of black-and-white movies and inheritances announced in drawing rooms. She almost laughed at the thought. Margot Chen, 29 years old, 3 months unemployed, surviving on ramen and the occasional freelance graphic design gig, didn't get mysterious letters about inheritances. She got bills and collection notices and cheerful postcards from her younger sister, who was currently backpacking through Europe on money Margot didn't have. But when she finally opened the envelope and unfolded the thick paper inside, that's exactly what it was. "Dear Ms. Chen," the letter began, and she could almost hear the words spoken in some lawyer's careful voice. "We are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Ms. Helena Voss, who passed away on August 3, 2019. Ms. Voss was your maternal great-aunt, and while we understand you may not have had personal contact with her, she was quite specific in her wishes that her property pass to you upon her death." Margot stopped reading and stared at the name. Helena Voss. It meant nothing to her. She tried to remember if her mother had ever mentioned a great-aunt, but her mother had been dead for 7 years now, and their conversations in those final months had been about hospital bills and morphine doses, not family trees. Her father had left when she was 6. There was her sister, Emma, and that was it. The Chen family wasn't large, wasn't close, wasn't the kind of family that had estates to pass down. She kept reading. The property in question is a residential estate located at 1847, Ashwood Lane in Greystone Hollow, Washington. The house has been unoccupied since Ms. Voss's relocation to assisted living in 2019. We ask that you contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the details of the inheritance and to arrange for the transfer of the deed. Please be advised that the property is being conveyed to you as is, and there are certain conditions attached to the bequest which we will explain when we speak. There was a phone number at the bottom, and a signature she couldn't quite read. Margot set the letter down on the table and stared at it as if it might disappear or reveal itself to be some elaborate prank. A house. Someone had left her a house. A woman she'd never met, never even heard of, had died and decided that Margot, broke, directionless, barely keeping her head above water, should have her house. Took her 2 days to call the number. She told herself she was being cautious, that it could be a scam, that nothing in life ever fell into your lap without strings attached. But really, she was afraid. Afraid of hope, maybe, or afraid of what it might mean if this turned out to be real. When she finally dialed, her hands were shaking. The lawyer who answered sounded exactly like she'd imagined. Older, patient, with a slight rasp that suggested decades of cigarettes and courtrooms. His name was Donald Marsh, and he seemed unsurprised to hear from her, as if he'd been waiting for her call with the certainty of someone who knew she would eventually give in to curiosity. "Ms. Chen," he said, and she could hear papers rustling in the background. "Thank you for contacting us. I imagine this has all come as quite a surprise." "You could say that," Margot replied. She was pacing her tiny apartment, phone pressed to her ear. "I don't understand. I've never heard of Helena Voss. Why would she leave me anything?" There was a pause, and Margot could almost see him choosing his words carefully. "Your great-aunt was a very private woman. She had no children of her own, and from what I understand, she became estranged from most of the family many years ago. But she was quite clear in her will. She wanted the house to go to you specifically, her great-niece through your mother's line. She left a note with her papers. Would you like me to read it to you?" Margot's throat felt tight. "Yes." More rustling. Then Marsh's voice, reading words that a dead woman had written for her. "To Margot, I know we never met, and I know this will seem strange, but I've followed your life from a distance, and I believe you're the right person for this house. It needs someone brave, someone who won't run from what they find. The house on Ashwood Lane has been in our family since it was built in 1983, and it deserves better than to rot away or be sold to strangers. I'm sorry for the burden this may cause you, but I'm hopeful you'll understand, in time, why it had to be you. The house will reveal itself when it's ready. Don't be afraid. Helena. The words hung in the air between them. Margot had stopped pacing. She was standing in the middle of her apartment, surrounded by thrift store furniture and unpaid bills, listening to a message from a ghost. What does she mean, what you find? Margot asked. Her voice sounded small in her own ears. I don't know, Marsh said, and she believed him. But there are conditions to the inheritance. You must visit the property within 30 days of receiving this letter. You must spend at least one night there, and you cannot sell the property for a minimum of 1 year after taking possession. If you choose not to accept these terms, the property will be donated to the county. That's it. That's it. Margot closed her eyes. A house. A free house. Even if it was falling apart, even if it was in the middle of nowhere, it was worth something. It was a chance at something different. And maybe that's what she needed. Something different. Something that would shake her out of the numbness that had settled over her life like dust. I'll come, she said. When can I see it? If you're enjoying this mysterious inheritance story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring you more captivating tales like Margot's journey into the unknown. 3 weeks later, Margot was driving her ancient Honda Civic up a winding mountain road, watching the trees grow thicker and the sky grow darker as she climbed higher into the wilderness. Greystone Hollow turned out to be less a town and more a scattering of buildings huddled together in a valley. A gas station, a diner, a general store, and maybe 30 houses spread out along roads that looked like they'd been carved by accident rather than design. The air was different up here, crisp and sharp with the smell of pine and something else. Something older and wilder that she couldn't quite name. She'd stopped at the gas station to ask for directions, and the woman behind the counter had given her a long, measuring look when she mentioned Ashwood Lane. The Voss place, the woman had said, not quite a question. She was in her 60s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see more than Margot wanted to show. You're the niece, then? Great niece, Margot corrected. Did you know her? Helena? The woman's expression didn't change. Everyone knew Helena. Not many people knew her well, if you understand the difference. That house has been empty for a long time. Probably best it stays that way. Margot had felt a chill run down her spine, but she'd forced herself to smile. Well, I'm just here to see it. Check things out. The woman had turned away then, dismissing her. The road splits about 2 miles up. Take the left fork. Keep going until you can't go any further. You'll know it when you see it. Now, following those directions, Margot understood what she'd meant. The road narrowed as she drove, paved giving way to gravel, giving way to something that was barely more than packed dirt. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the afternoon light. It felt like driving into a tunnel or into the past, each mile taking her further from the world she knew. And then, suddenly, the trees opened up, and there it was. Margot stopped the car so abruptly it stalled. She sat there, engine quiet, staring through the windshield at what she'd inherited. The house was enormous. That was her first thought. How had no one mentioned that it was enormous? It rose 3 stories from the clearing, all dark stone and sharp angles, with a mansard roof and windows that reflected the dying light like closed eyes. It looked like something out of a gothic novel, like something that should have been built in the Victorian era, not the 1980s. But there were telltale signs of its true age if you looked closely. The particular style of the windows, the slope of the roof, the way certain architectural elements seemed to be reaching for grandeur but landing somewhere in the realm of ambitious excess. It was beautiful in the way that abandoned things are beautiful, full of melancholy and possibility and the weight of all the life that had once filled it. Ivy crawled up one wall, and several of the shutters hung crooked. The stone was dark gray, almost black in places, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was a wide porch that wrapped around the front, and a turret on one corner that made the whole structure look slightly off balance, like it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. Margot got out of the car slowly, her legs stiff from the drive. The air was colder here, and so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. No birds, no wind, just silence, thick and expectant, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She walked toward it, gravel crunching under her feet, and with each step she felt the strangeness of the moment settling over her. This was hers. This massive, brooding structure in the middle of nowhere was legally, officially hers. It seemed impossible. It seemed like the kind of thing that happened to other people in stories, not to unemployed graphic designers who could barely afford their rent. The front door was solid oak, carved with an intricate pattern that might have been leaves or flames. It was hard to tell under the layers of grime and weatherware. Margot pulled the key from her pocket, the one Marsh had mailed to her along with a thick packet of documents she still hadn't finished reading. Her hand was shaking as she fitted it into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open on hinges that didn't creak at all, which somehow seemed wrong. Abandoned houses were supposed to creak. They were supposed to groan and protest and announce your arrival to whatever ghosts called them home. This house welcomed her in silence. The interior was dark, all the curtains drawn or windows shuttered. Margot fumbled for a light switch and found one. Flicking it up, nothing happened. Of course, the power was probably shut off. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across what appeared to be a grand foyer. Even in the dimness, she could see the scale of it. A staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved from the same dark wood as the door. The floor was marble, black and white in a checkerboard pattern that seemed to stretch forever. There were doorways leading off in multiple directions, and above her, she could just make out the shape of a chandelier, its crystals coated in dust. The beam of her flashlight caught something on the wall, and she moved closer. Portraits. There were portraits lining the walls, dozens of them, all in ornate frames. Faces stared out at her from the past. Severe men in suits, women with carefully arranged hair, children who looked too solemn for their ages. She wondered if any of them were Helena, if she'd recognize her great-aunt if she saw her. "Hello!" Her voice echoed strangely in the space, bouncing off walls and disappearing into rooms she couldn't see. "Anyone here?" Silence answered her, of course. What had she expected? She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps loud on the marble. Through one doorway was what must have been a living room. Furniture covered in white sheets, more portraits, a fireplace large enough to stand in. Through another was a dining room with a table that could seat 20. The kitchen was industrial-sized, something from a different era, with appliances she recognized from her childhood and copper pots hanging from hooks in the ceiling. Everything was covered in dust, but nothing seemed damaged. It was as if someone had simply walked out one day and never come back, leaving everything exactly as it was. Waiting, Margot found herself climbing the stairs, drawn upward by curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. The second floor was a maze of hallways and bedrooms, each one frozen in time. One room was clearly a child's nursery, though the paint was faded and the crib looked antique. Another was filled with bookshelves, thousands of books lining every wall, their spines cracked and faded. She ran her fingers along them, reading titles. History, philosophy, occult studies, books in languages she didn't recognize. It was in the third-floor hallway that she found the door. Actually, it found her. She'd been walking, her flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, when she'd noticed that one section of the wall looked different. Darker, maybe, or set back slightly. She'd stopped and run her hand over the surface, and suddenly there it was. A seam barely visible, outlining the shape of a door where no door should be. Her heart was pounding now. She pressed against it, pushed, but nothing happened. There was no handle, no lock, nothing to indicate how it might open. But she could feel it there, could sense the space beyond it like a hollow in a tooth, something missing that demanded to be explored. She stepped back, sweeping her light across the hidden door, and that's when she saw it. Carved into the wall above where the door should be, so faint she almost missed it, were words. She had to stand on her toes to read them, had to angle the light just right. What no one dared to open lies waiting. The truth demands a price. Enter if you must, but know that some doors, once opened, change everything. Margot felt ice slide down her spine. She stood there in the darkness of the third-floor hallway of a house she'd inherited from a woman she'd never met, staring at a warning carved into stone. And for the first time since she'd received that letter, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Outside, the sun was setting, and the house was growing darker. She could hear something now, a sound like wind or breathing or the settling of old bones. The silence had broken, replaced by something that felt almost alive, something that was aware of her presence and curious about what she would do next. Margot stood frozen, her flashlight beam trained on the hidden door, and made a decision. She would stay the night as the will required. She would explore this place, and she would find out what Helena Voss had wanted her to find, what secret this house held that no one had dared to open. But not tonight. Tonight, she would go back downstairs, would find a room that didn't feel like it was watching her, would try to sleep in a house full of shadows and mysteries and doors that shouldn't exist. Tomorrow, she will begin searching for answers. Tomorrow, she will be brave. Tonight, she would simply survive. Morning came with a cruelty that Margot hadn't anticipated. She'd spent the night in what appeared to be a guest bedroom on the second floor, curled up on top of a dusty bedspread with her jacket pulled tight around her shoulders and her phone clutched in one hand like a talisman. Sleep had come in fragments, broken by sounds she couldn't identify, creaks and groans that might have been the house settling or might have been something else entirely. Every time she drifted off, she dreamed of doors opening in the darkness, of hands reaching out from behind walls, of Helena Voss standing at the foot of the bed with her mouth open in a silent scream. Now, with pale sunlight filtering through the gaps in the curtains, the house seemed less menacing and more simply sad. Margot sat up, her back aching from the uncomfortable position she'd slept in, and looked around the room with fresh eyes. It was actually quite beautiful in a faded way, wallpaper with a pattern of tiny flowers, a vanity with an oval mirror, a wardrobe that probably weighed more than her car. Everything covered in that same layer of dust, that same sense of time suspended. She pulled out her phone and checked for signal. One bar flickering in and out. No messages from Emma, who probably didn't even know she'd left Seattle. No emails, no notifications, nothing to tether her to the world she'd left behind. Just her and this house and whatever secrets it held. Margot stood and stretched, joints popping. Her mouth tasted like copper and fear. She needed coffee, needed food, needed to figure out what the hell she was doing here. The nearest town was 40 minutes away, and she'd passed exactly 3 other buildings on the drive up, none of them looking particularly welcoming or open for business. She'd brought some granola bars and bottled water in her car, enough to last a couple days if she was careful. She made her way downstairs, the morning light transforming the house into something different than it had been the night before. In daylight, she could see the details she'd missed. The intricate crown molding, the parquet floors beneath the marble in some rooms, the stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across the walls. It was like walking through a museum or a mausoleum, everything perfectly preserved, everything waiting. The kitchen was her first priority. She needed to see if any of the utilities were working, needed to establish some baseline of livability before she could think about anything else. The faucet sputtered when she turned it, coughed up rust-colored water, then cleared to something that ran clean and cold. That was something. The stove was gas, and when she tried one of the burners, it lit immediately, a perfect blue flame that suggested the tank was still full or the line was still connected. Small miracles. She ate a granola bar standing at the sink, looking out the window at the forest that pressed in on all sides. The house sat in a clearing, but barely. The trees were so close she could see individual needles on the pine branches, could watch shadows move between trunks. It was beautiful, she supposed, if you liked that kind of isolation, if you didn't mind being cut off from the world, surrounded by wilderness that probably hadn't changed much in 1,000 years. Her great-aunt had lived here. Helena Voss had woken up in this house, had walked these halls, had looked out these windows at these trees. What kind of person chose this? What kind of person built a mansion in the middle of nowhere and then lived in it alone for decades? Margot pulled out the papers Marsh had sent her and spread them across the kitchen counter. The deed, the property survey, copies of Helena's will. And there, near the bottom of the stack, something she hadn't noticed before. A separate envelope marked Personal Effects Inventory. She opened it and found several pages of typed lists. Furniture, artwork, books, kitchen items. The mundane catalog of a life. But at the very end, there was a handwritten note. The ink faded but still legible. The library holds the history. The study holds the truth. The third floor holds what we couldn't destroy. God forgive us all. Margot read it 3 times, feeling her pulse quicken. The third floor, where she'd found the hidden door. What we couldn't destroy. The words felt like a warning and an invitation, like Helena had known exactly who would be reading them and what they would need to know. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then she gathered her courage and headed for the library she'd glimpsed the night before. The room was even more impressive in daylight. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, and a ladder on rails allowed access to the higher shelves. There was a desk in one corner, massive and ornate, with a leather chair that looked like it had been expensive once. The windows here were tall and narrow, the glass wavy with age, and they let in just enough light to read by. Margot started with the desk. The drawers were unlocked, which surprised her. She'd expected locked compartments, hidden keys, all the trappings of mystery. But instead, everything was open, accessible, as if Helena had wanted whoever came after her to find what was here. The first drawer held office supplies. Pens, paper clips, a stapler that looked like it was from the 1970s. The second held files, property taxes, utility bills, receipts for repairs and maintenance. Evidence of a life lived, of a house kept running even when its owner was alone. The third drawer held journals. There were maybe 20 of them, all identical, black leather covers, lined pages, dates written in silver ink on the spines. Margot pulled them out one by one, arranging them on the desk in chronological order. The earliest was dated 1983. The latest was 2019, the year Helena had moved to assisted living. 36 years of journals. 36 years of thoughts and observations and secrets written down in neat, precise handwriting. Margot opened the first one, her hands trembling slightly. The first entry was dated March 15, 1983. Construction is complete. Marcus says the house is everything we dreamed of, and he's right. It's magnificent. More than we need, certainly, but that was always the point, wasn't it? To build something that would last, something that would matter. The children are settling in. Sarah loves her turret room, and Michael has claimed the library as his domain. I think we'll be happy here. I think this house will be good for us. Margot felt a strange pang reading those words. Helena had had children, a husband. This house had been built for a family, for dreams of happiness and permanence. What had happened to them? Why had Helena ended up alone? She flipped forward, reading entries at random. April 1983. The forest is louder than I expected. At night, we can hear things moving through the trees. Marcus says it's just deer, but I'm not so sure. There's something about this place that feels watched. June 1983. Sarah says there are people in the walls. I told her it's just the house settling, old pipes and new with learning to live together. But tonight I heard them too. Whispers. Or maybe just the wind. The entries grew darker as Margot read. September 1983. Marcus wants to tear down the wall in the third-floor hallway. He says there's dead space there, room we could use. But the contractor refuses. He says some walls aren't meant to come down, that the previous owner was specific about it. Previous owner? This land was empty when we bought it. Marcus insists we built this house from the ground up. But I've started to wonder. Margot felt ice forming in her stomach. She flipped faster now, scanning for keywords, for explanations. December 1983. Michael is having nightmares. He says a man comes to his room at night, an old man with no face who stands at the foot of his bed and watches him sleep. The doctor says it's stress from the move, from starting at a new school. But I see the way Michael looks at the corners of rooms now. like he's expecting something to step out of the shadows. January 1984. Marcus found the door. I told him to leave it alone, but he's obsessed now. He says there are spaces in this house that don't match the blueprints, rooms that shouldn't exist. He's been measuring walls, tapping on panels, searching for hollow spaces. Last night I woke up and he was gone. I found him on the 3rd floor, standing in front of that door, his hands pressed against the wood. He was crying. I asked him what was wrong, and he said, "It's calling me. Can't you hear it calling?" Margot's hands were shaking now. She closed the journal and opened another, this one from 1985. The first entry stopped her cold. They're gone. Marcus took the children and left in the middle of the night. No note, no explanation. Just gone. The police came, took statements, said there was nothing they could do. He's their father. He has every right to take them. But I know it wasn't his choice. I know the house pushed them away. I know it wants me alone. Margot sat back in the chair, her mind reeling. Helena's family had abandoned her. Or had they fled? Had something in this house driven them away? She kept reading, entry after entry, watching Helena's life narrow and darken. 1986. I tried to leave. Got as far as the end of the driveway before I turned back. Something won't let me go. Or maybe I won't let myself go. What would be the point? The house is all I have now. 1990. I've stopped trying to open the door. Whatever is behind it can stay there. I've made my peace with this place, with what it is. We have an understanding now, the house and I. The entries became less frequent after that. Whole months would pass with nothing written, then a single paragraph about the weather or a book she'd read. It was like watching someone fade, like watching a life contract until it was small enough to fit inside these walls. Margot reached the final journal, the one from 2019. There were only a handful of entries, the handwriting shakier now, harder to read. February 3, 2019. They're moving me to a facility in town. The doctors say I can't live alone anymore, that it's not safe. They don't understand. The house has kept me safe all these years. But I'm tired now. Too tired to fight. I'm leaving the house to Margot, my sister's granddaughter. I've been watching her, following her life from a distance. She has my sister's stubbornness, my grandmother's courage. She'll need both. The house will test her, but I think she can handle it. I think she might be the one who can finally open that door and face what's inside. God help her. God help us all. The last entry was dated February 20th, 2019, just days before Helena must have moved out. I had a dream last night. I was young again, and Marcus was with me, and the children were laughing in the garden. We were happy. When I woke up, I could still hear them, the laughter, the voices. But the house was empty. It's always been empty, really. Just me and the walls and whatever lives in the spaces between. I'm leaving tomorrow. I wonder if the house will miss me. I wonder if I'll miss it. Strange thought. Missing the thing that took everything from you. But I suppose that's what love is sometimes. The beautiful horror of it. The house was my prison and my sanctuary. I hope Margot understands that. I hope she's braver than I was. Margot closed the journal and sat in the silence of the library, tears running down her face without her quite knowing why. She was crying for Helena, she supposed. For this woman she'd never met who'd spent 36 years alone in this house, who'd built it with love and lost everything inside it, who'd stayed anyway because leaving seemed impossible. But she was also crying for herself, for the weight of what she'd inherited. Not just a house, but a legacy of sorrow and secrets and doors that shouldn't be opened but called to you anyway. She wiped her eyes and stood. The study. Helena had mentioned a study. The library holds the history. The study holds the truth. It took her 20 minutes to find it. The house was a maze, rooms leading to other rooms, hallways that seemed to double back on themselves. But finally, on the 2nd floor at the end of a narrow corridor she'd somehow missed the night before, she found a door that was different from the others. Heavier, darker, with a lock that looked newer than everything else in the house. She tried her key, the one Marsh had given her. It didn't fit. She tried several other keys she'd found in the kitchen drawer. Nothing. The door stayed locked, its secret sealed. Margot stood there, frustration building in her chest. She'd come all this way, had spent a sleepless night in this house, had read through Helena's journals and felt her heart break for a woman she'd never know. And now, when she was finally getting close to answers, she was stopped by a locked door. She pressed her hand against the wood, feeling the grain beneath her palm. "What are you hiding?" she whispered. "What was so important that Helena locked you away?" And then, so faint she almost missed it, she heard something. A sound from inside the study, like paper rustling, or like breathing. Margot jerked her hand back, her heart hammering. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. There it was again. Definitely movement, definitely something alive on the other side. "Hello!" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Is someone in there?" No response. Just that sound, that rustling breathing sound that made her skin crawl. She stepped back from the door, mind racing. Could someone be living here? Could someone have broken in, made the house their home? It seemed impossible. The house was so isolated, so hidden. But stranger things had happened. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was what Helena had been afraid of. What had driven Marcus and the children away. What had lived in the walls and whispered in the night. Margot stood in that hallway, frozen between curiosity and terror, and made a decision. She would find a way into that study. She would break the door down if she had to. But first, she needed to understand more about this house, about its history, about what had happened here. She went back to the library and gathered all the journals, stacking them carefully. Then she carried them down to the kitchen, where the light was better and she could spread them out. She was going to read every single entry, was going to map out Helena's life and the life of this house. She was going to find the patterns, the clues, the warnings, and then she was going to go up to the 3rd floor. She was going to find that hidden door, and she was going to discover what no one had dared to open. Because Helena had been right about one thing. Margot had her grandmother's courage and her great-aunt's stubbornness, and she'd spent too much of her life being afraid, being careful, playing it safe and ending up nowhere. This house was hers now. These secrets were hers to uncover. And whatever price the truth demanded, she was willing to pay it. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, but inside the house, the shadows seemed to deepen. Margot could feel the house watching her, could sense its attention focusing on her like a magnifying glass focusing light. It knew what she was planning. It knew she wouldn't back down. Good, she thought. Let it know. Let it be understood that she wasn't going to run like the others, wasn't going to spend 36 years hiding from the truth. She opened the first journal again and began to read, more carefully this time, looking for the details she'd missed, the clues Helena had left behind. The house settled around her with a sound like a sigh, and somewhere deep in its bones, something waited. The game, if it was a game, had begun. And Margot Chen, broke and desperate and braver than she knew, was all in. Before we continue with Margot's descent into the basement and her shocking discoveries, if you're invested in this story, please hit the like button and share this with someone who loves mystery and supernatural tales. It really helps the channel grow. The sun had passed its zenith by the time Margot finished reading through the journals for the 2nd time. She'd made notes, had created a timeline on the back of an old envelope, had traced the progression of Helena's unraveling with a pencil that kept breaking under the pressure of her grip. The pattern was clear now, painfully clear, like watching a slow-motion car crash you couldn't stop. 1983. The house is built. The family moves in. Everything is perfect. 1983. Late summer. Strange sounds begin. Sarah talks about people in the walls. Marcus becomes obsessed with the hidden spaces. 1984. The nightmares intensify. Michael stops speaking. Marcus finds the 3rd floor door. 1985. The family disappears in the night. Helena is left alone. 1986 to 2019. Helena lives in the house, a prisoner by choice or circumstance, watching the years pass through windows that seem to show less and less of the outside world. But there were gaps in the story, pieces missing. Helena wrote about the door, about the spaces that didn't match the blueprints, but she never explained what was behind it. She mentioned the previous owner, then seemed to forget she'd written it. She talked about understanding the house, making peace with it, but never said what that piece cost. Margot rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her. She'd been awake for over 30 hours now, running on adrenaline and granola bars and the stubborn refusal to give in to fear. But her body was starting to rebel, her thoughts growing fuzzy around the edges. She needed to sleep, needed to rest before she tackled the study or the third floor. But the thought of closing her eyes in this house, of letting her guard down even for a moment, made her stomach clench. Instead, she decided to explore, to map the house in daylight, to understand its layout and its logic, if it had any logic at all. She grabbed a notebook from her car and began a systematic tour, starting with the first floor. The entrance hall she'd already seen. The living room with its sheet-covered furniture. The dining room with its impossible table. The kitchen where she'd made her camp. But there were other rooms she'd missed in her initial exploration. A conservatory with windows on 3 sides and dead plants in ceramic pots. A music room with a grand piano under a canvas cover and yellowed sheet music scattered across a stand. A bathroom with fixtures that looked like they'd been salvaged from a hotel. A pantry the size of her Seattle apartment. Every room told a story of excess, of ambition, of someone trying to build something that would last forever. But every room also felt wrong somehow, like the proportions were slightly off or the angles didn't quite meet the way they should. Margot found herself getting disoriented, losing track of which direction was which, having to backtrack to find doorways she'd just walked through. The second floor was worse. The hallways seemed longer than they should be, and she could have sworn some of the doors were in different places than they'd been the night before. She counted bedrooms, 12 of them, each one decorated in a different style, each one frozen in time like a museum exhibit. The master bedroom was the largest, with a 4-poster bed and a balcony overlooking the forest. She found clothes still hanging in the closet, dresses from the 80s with shoulder pads and bold prints, men's suits gathering dust on wooden hangers. In one of the children's rooms, Sarah's room, she guessed, based on the pink wallpaper and the collection of dolls arranged on shelves, she found something that made her stop. A growth chart, drawn directly on the door frame in pencil, with dates and heights marked in a child's careful handwriting. The last entry was dated December 1984. Sarah Voss, age 7, 49 inches tall. Margot reached out and touched the mark, feeling the indentation where the pencil had pressed into the wood. A little girl had stood here, had wanted to track how she was growing, had thought she had a future in this house. And then, just weeks later, she was gone. Taken away in the middle of the night by a father who was crying in front of a door that wouldn't open. The study was still locked. Margot tried the door again, pulling hard on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pressed her ear against it, listening for that rustling sound, but heard nothing. Whatever had been in there, if anything had been in there, was silent now. She was about to move on when she noticed something she'd missed before. Scratches on the door frame, long and deep, like someone had clawed at the wood. And beneath them, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, more words carved into the frame. Don't let it out. Margot felt her blood turn to ice. Let what out? What was in the study that needed to be kept locked away? She forced herself to move, to keep exploring. The third floor was calling to her, that hidden door with its ominous warning. But she wanted to see the rest of the house first. Wanted to understand the whole structure before she faced whatever waited up there. The third floor was smaller than the others, just a handful of rooms and a long central hallway. Most of the rooms were empty, just bare floors and walls, as if they'd never been furnished or the furniture had been removed long ago. But one room was different. It was at the end of the hall, and when Margot opened the door, she found herself in what appeared to be an office or workspace. There was a desk piled with papers, filing cabinets lining one wall, and, most strangely, a large map of the property pinned to the opposite wall, covered in marks and notations. Margot moved closer to the map, studying it. The house was marked in the center, a perfect square drawn with ruler straight lines. But around it, spreading out into the forest, were dozens of other marks. Circles and X's and question marks, dates written next to some of them, notes in handwriting she recognized as Helena's. June 1987, heard voices. Approximately 200 yards northwest. March 1990 found clearing, signs of recent activity. October 1995 saw lights moving through trees, followed for half a mile before losing track. August 2001 found structure partially collapsed. Old. Very old. There were more, dozens more, a chronicle of years spent investigating the land around the house. Margot felt a chill run through her. Helena hadn't just lived here. She'd been searching for something, exploring, documenting. But what had she been looking for? She turned to the desk and started going through the papers. Reports, handwritten notes, photographs. The photographs were particularly unsettling. Images of the forest, of clearings and rock formations, of things that looked almost like buildings but weren't quite, structures that seemed to grow out of the earth rather than being built on top of it. And then she found the folder. It was unmarked, just plain manila, buried under a stack of property tax documents. When she opened it, a newspaper clipping fell out. The paper was yellow and brittle, the date in the corner reading August 12, 1952. Local asylum demolished after tragic fire, the headline read. Margot's hands trembled as she read the article. The Ashwood Psychiatric Hospital, which has served the Greystone Hollow community for 30 years, was destroyed by fire last night in an incident that claimed the lives of 17 patients and 3 staff members. Officials say the fire started in the basement and spread rapidly through the wooden structure before firefighters could arrive. The hospital, which had been the subject of numerous complaints and investigations over the years regarding patient treatment, will not be rebuilt. The property, spanning nearly 100 acres, has been purchased by the county and will be returned to forest land. Dr. Helena Voss, the hospital's director, could not be reached for comment. Margot read the article 3 times, her mind racing. Ashwood Psychiatric Hospital. Dr. Helena Voss. Helena's last name was Voss. This couldn't be a coincidence. She dug deeper into the folder and found more clippings, more documentation. Articles about the hospital's troubled history, about experimental treatments and patients who disappeared, about families who complained that their loved ones went in for minor ailments and came out changed, or didn't come out at all. And there, at the bottom of the folder, was a land survey from 1982, the year before Helena's house was built. It showed the property boundaries, the topography, the location of old foundations and structures. And right where Helena's house now stood, the survey noted, site of former Ashwood Psychiatric Hospital, demolished 1952. Foundation and basement structures remain. Recommend removal before construction. But the foundation hadn't been removed. Margot understood that now with a clarity that made her feel sick. The house hadn't been built from the ground up. It had been built on top of something else, on top of the ruins of an asylum where people had died, where terrible things had happened. Helena had known. She must have known. And she'd built here anyway, or maybe she hadn't known until after, until it was too late to leave. Margot sat down heavily in the desk chair, trying to process what she'd learned. The house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was built on haunted ground, on the bones of an institution where suffering had been commonplace and death had come violently. The voices in the walls, the spaces that didn't match the blueprints, the door that no one could open. It was all connected to what lay beneath. She thought about Helena's note. What we couldn't destroy, not what they wouldn't destroy, what they couldn't. Whatever was down there, in the basement or the foundations or the spaces between, it had survived the fire that had killed 20 people. It had survived demolition and time and 30 years of forest growth. And then Helena had built a house on top of it, had sealed it in stone and wood, had tried to contain it. But you couldn't contain something like that forever. Eventually, it would push back. It would call out. It would find the weak spots and exploit them. Marcus had heard it calling. Michael had seen something at the foot of his bed. Sarah had heard people in the walls. And Helena had spent the rest of her life trying to keep the door closed, trying to maintain the seal. Now that responsibility had passed to Margot. No, she said aloud, her voice echoing in the empty office. No, this is insane. I'm not doing this. I'm not staying in a house built on top of an asylum. I'm not responsible for whatever is down there. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying to herself. She'd read Helena's journals, had felt the pull of this mystery, had already started to understand why Helena hadn't been able to leave. The house wanted answers. The dead wanted acknowledgement. And Margot, whether she liked it or not, was now part of this story. She stood and gathered the folder, the clippings, the photographs. She would take them downstairs, would add them to her collection of evidence. And then she would decide what to do next. But as she turned to leave, she heard it. A sound from somewhere below her, from the bowels of the house. Not rustling this time. Not breathing. This was something else. Something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up and her primitive brain scream at her to run. It was singing. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. Someone was singing in the basement. Margot froze, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The voice was high and thin, like a child's voice, and it was singing something she almost recognized. A lullaby, maybe, or a nursery rhyme. The words were too distorted by distance and stone to make out, but the melody carried, rising and falling in a way that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so utterly terrifying. She forced herself to move, to walk out of the office and down the hall toward the stairs. The singing continued, constant and eerily cheerful. When she reached the second floor, it was louder. When she reached the first floor, she could almost make out words. Ring around the rosy pocket full of posies. Margot's blood turned to ice. She knew that song. Every child knew that song. And she knew what it was really about, the plague, death, burning bodies. A children's game built on mass graves. The singing was coming from a door she'd noticed earlier but hadn't opened. A door in the back of the kitchen, sturdy and reinforced, that she'd assumed led to a pantry or storage room. But now she understood. It was the basement door, and someone or something was down there singing. She approached it slowly, her whole body screaming at her to turn around, to get in her car and drive away and never look back. But she kept walking, kept moving forward, because some part of her needed to know, needed to see, needed to understand what she'd inherited. The door was unlocked. The knob turned easily in her hand, and the door swung open to reveal a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. The singing stopped immediately, cut off mid-word, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. Margot pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it down into the dark. The beam caught rough stone walls, wooden steps that looked old and unstable, and at the bottom, just at the edge of the light's reach, what might have been a floor or might have been something else. "Hello!" Her voice sounded small and scared, and she hated herself for it. "Is someone down there?" No answer. Just silence and darkness and the smell of damp earth and something else, something chemical and wrong. She put her foot on the first step. Creaked but held. She descended slowly, testing each step before putting her full weight on it, her flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the walls. The stone was dark with moisture and age, and in places she could see marks, scratches or maybe letters. It was hard to tell. The temperature dropped as she went lower, and by the time she reached the bottom, her breath was visible in the air. The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching out in multiple directions, the walls lined with old pipes and electrical conduits. But it was what stood in the center of the space that made her stop and stare. It was a door, an old door, iron-banded and studded with rivets, set into what looked like the entrance to a tunnel or corridor that led deeper into the earth. The door was partially open, and beyond it was darkness so complete that her flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by it. And on the door, scratched deep into the metal, were the same words she'd seen upstairs, "Don't let it out." But below them, in what looked like more recent markings, was a response. Too late. Margot felt her legs go weak. She wanted to run, wanted to scramble back up those stairs and never come down here again. But she was frozen, staring at that open door, at the darkness beyond, at the evidence that someone had been here recently. Someone had opened this door. Someone had gone inside, or something had come out. A sound made her spin around, a scraping, dragging sound coming from somewhere in the darkness to her left. She swung her flashlight beam toward it and caught a glimpse of movement, something pale and quick disappearing behind a support column. "Who's there?" She was backing toward the stairs now, her heart hammering. "Show yourself." The scraping sound came again, closer this time. And then, from the darkness, a voice. A woman's voice, old and cracked and full of pain. "You shouldn't have come here." Margot's scream caught in her throat. She turned and ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, not caring if they collapsed beneath her, just needing to get out, to get away from whatever was down there. She burst through the door into the kitchen, slammed it behind her, and stood there gasping, her whole body shaking. For a long moment, she just breathed, trying to calm her racing heart, trying to convince herself that what she'd heard wasn't real, couldn't be real. But she knew better. She'd heard it, had seen movement in the darkness. There was someone or something in the basement of this house. The door behind her rattled slightly, as if something on the other side was testing it. Margot jumped away, her eyes wide. The rattling stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and expectant. She needed to get out. Needed to leave this house and call someone, the police, a priest, an exorcist, whoever dealt with situations like this. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't. Because Helena's words were echoing in her mind. She'll need both courage and stubbornness. She might be the one who can finally open that door and face what's inside. Helena had left this house to her for a reason. Had chosen her specifically to deal with whatever lived in the basement, whatever couldn't be destroyed. And running away now would mean failing, would mean all of Helena's suffering had been for nothing. Margot pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, forcing herself to think logically, to make a plan. She had pieces of the puzzle now, the asylum, the fire, Dr. Edmund Voss, the door that led deeper into the earth. But she needed more. Needed to understand what had happened here, what experiments had been conducted, what had made this place so terrible that it couldn't rest even after decades of abandonment. The study. The locked study on the second floor. That's where Helena had kept the truth, the documentation that would explain everything. She needed to get into that room, and she needed to do it before dark. Because if there were things in this house that moved and spoke, she didn't want to face them at night. She went to the utility closet and found what she needed: a crowbar, a hammer, a flashlight more powerful than her phone. Tools that could break down a door if necessary. She was done being passive, done letting fear control her. If this house wanted to test her, fine. She'd pass the test. The climb to the second floor felt longer this time, the house seeming to stretch and distort around her. But she made it to the study door, tools in hand, determination overriding terror. "Okay," she said to the door, to the house, to whatever was listening. "You want me to know the truth? Fine. I'm ready. Show me what happened here. Show me what Helena couldn't face." She raised the crowbar and brought it down hard on the lock. The sound of metal on metal rang through the house like a bell, and somewhere in the distance, she could have sworn she heard someone laugh. The lock held. She hit it again, and again. On the fourth strike, something gave way with a crack, and the door swung open. Margot stepped back, breathing hard, waiting to see what would emerge. But nothing moved. The room beyond was dark and still. She raised her flashlight and stepped inside. The study was smaller than she'd expected, and it was filled with filing cabinets and boxes, papers stacked everywhere. But what dominated the room, what drew her eye immediately, was the wall opposite the door. It was covered, completely covered, with photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and what looked like medical charts, all connected by red string in a pattern that made her think of spider webs or madness. Margot moved closer, her flashlight beam tracking across the wall. And slowly, piece by piece, the story revealed itself. Dr. Edmund Voss had been Helena's grandfather. He'd run Ashwood Psychiatric Hospital from 1920 until the fire in 1952. And during those 32 years, he'd been conducting experiments. Not treatments, experiments. Trying to understand the nature of consciousness, the boundaries between life and death, the possibility of preserving the mind beyond the body. There were photographs of patients, dozens of them, their faces blank and staring. Medical charts detailing procedures that made Margot's stomach turn, lobotomies, shock therapy, sensory deprivation. And notes, endless notes in Edmund's precise handwriting, documenting his theories about the soul, about memory, about the electrical patterns that made up human thought. "The mind is not the brain," one note read. "The brain is merely the receiver. The mind exists in the spaces between, in the quantum foam that underlies reality. And if we can learn to manipulate those spaces, we can preserve consciousness indefinitely. We can make death optional." Margot felt sick. She moved along the wall, reading more, understanding more. Edmund Voss had been trying to create a kind of immortality, had been recording the minds of his patients, storing them somehow in the very structure of the hospital itself. He'd built rooms designed to trap consciousness, had wired the building with strange devices meant to amplify and preserve thought patterns. And then there was the fire that had killed 20 people, that had destroyed the hospital but not the basement, not the foundation, not the spaces where Edmund had conducted his most intense experiments. There was a photograph of the aftermath. Blackened walls, collapsed roofs, and in the center of it all, still standing, a stone structure that looked like it had been built to survive anything. The basement entrance. The door Margot had seen. "He survived the fire," a handwritten note said, this one in Helena's writing. "Grandfather survived, but he was changed. Burned but not destroyed. They found him 3 days later, wandering in the woods, unable to speak. He lived for 6 more months before dying, but he never said a word about what happened that night. What he did. What he released." Margot's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the flashlight. She understood now. Edmund Voss had trapped the minds of his patients in the structure of the hospital. And when the fire came, when the bodies died, those minds had been set free or set loose. Consciousness without form, thought without body, intelligence and memory and personality trapped in the quantum spaces between atoms, unable to die, unable to leave, unable to do anything but exist in a kind of hell. And Helena, knowing this, understanding what her grandfather had done, had built a house on top of it, had tried to contain it, to seal it in stone, to keep it from spreading. She'd sacrificed her family, her life, everything trying to maintain the seal. But seals broke. Doors opened. And now the responsibility was Margot's. She stepped back from the wall, her mind reeling. This was impossible. This was insane. Consciousness couldn't exist without a body. Couldn't be trapped in stone and wood and empty air. It violated everything she knew about science, about reality, about the way the world worked. But she'd heard the singing, had seen movement in the darkness, had felt the house watching her, had sensed the intelligence behind it all. And whether she believed in it or not, whether it made sense or not, it was real. The evidence was all around her. Helena's journals, Edmund's notes, the history of this place. It all pointed to the same impossible truth. There were people trapped in this house. Or what remained of people. Consciousness and memory and suffering. Preserved beyond death by a madman's experiments and a granddaughter's desperate attempt to contain what couldn't be contained. Margot sank down into the desk chair, the weight of understanding crushing her. Helena had known what she was passing on, what burden she was giving to Margot. And she'd done it anyway because someone had to carry it. Someone had to be responsible for the dead. "God help me," Margot whispered into the darkness. "What am I supposed to do?" The house didn't answer. But from somewhere below, faint and distant, the singing started again. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down." And Margot Chen, sitting in a study full of madness and evidence, surrounded by the documentation of atrocities and attempts at impossible science, made a decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't abandon these people, or whatever they were now, to an eternity of suffering. Helena had spent 36 years trying to keep the door closed, trying to maintain the seal. But maybe that was the wrong approach. Maybe the door needed to be opened. Maybe what was trapped here needed to be set free, not contained. Maybe the only way to end this was to face it directly, to go down into the darkness and confront what Edmund Voss had created. It was a terrible idea. It would probably get her killed or worse. But it was the right thing to do. And Margot, who'd spent most of her life playing it safe and ending up nowhere, was done being careful. She stood, gathered up as many documents as she could carry, and headed back downstairs. She had research to do, a plan to make, courage to summon. And when night fell, when the house grew dark and the singing grew louder, she would descend into the basement one more time. This time she wouldn't run. This time, she would see what lay beyond that iron-banded door. And whatever she found there, whatever horror Edmund Voss had left behind, she would face it. Because someone had to. Because Helena had believed she could. And because the dead deserved better than an eternity trapped in stone. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Margot had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. 3 hours to prepare for what might be the last decision she ever made. She set the documents on the kitchen table and began to read, to plan, to steel herself for what was coming. And in the walls around her, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this new heir would finally do what Helena never could. Open the door, face the truth, and let the dead speak at last. The sun was a burning orange wound on the horizon when Margot finished her preparations. She'd spent the last 3 hours reading through every document she could find, cross-referencing Edmund Voss's notes with Helena's journals, trying to piece together not just what had happened, but how to undo it, if it could be undone at all. What she'd learned had changed her understanding of everything. Edmund Voss hadn't been a simple monster conducting cruel experiments. He'd been a man consumed by grief. His wife, Catherine, had died in 1919 during the Spanish flu pandemic, and he'd watched her fade over 3 agonizing days, her mind deteriorating before her body gave out. In his notes, he'd written about those final hours with the kind of detail that suggested the memory was burned into him, inescapable. She didn't recognize me at the end. One entry read, "The fever had taken her mind first, and she looked at me like I was a stranger. All those years of love, of shared experience, of building a life together, gone. Erased, as if she'd never existed as the woman I knew. And I realized then that death is not the worst thing. The worst thing is losing yourself before death comes. Watching the person you love disappear while their body still breathes. That loss had driven him. He'd opened the asylum not to help people, but to study them. To understand the relationship between mind and body, between consciousness and the physical structures that housed it. He'd wanted to prove that the mind could exist independently, that personality and memory and everything that made a person who they were could survive beyond the death of the brain. And he'd discovered something that should have remained undiscovered. The notes became more technical, more detailed, as his experiments progressed. He'd built rooms lined with copper wire, had created what he called resonance chambers, designed to amplify and record the electrical patterns of thought. He'd subjected patients to increasingly extreme conditions: sensory deprivation, electrical stimulation, chemical alterations, all while monitoring their brain activity with equipment he'd built himself. And then, in 1948, he'd made his breakthrough. Subject 47 expired at 3:17 a.m. The note was dated March 3, 1948. Cardiac arrest as expected given the dosage. But for 47 seconds after clinical death, the resonance chamber continued to register activity. Patterns consistent with conscious thought. Fragmented, certainly. Confused. But undeniably present. The mind persisted beyond the body. I was right. Catherine, my darling, I was right. Margot had read that passage 3 times, feeling ice spread through her veins. Edmund had killed someone, had murdered a patient, and celebrated because it proved his theory. And that was just the beginning. Over the next 4 years, he'd refined his technique. Had learned how to prolong that post-death consciousness, to stabilize it, to trap it in the resonance chambers he'd built throughout the asylum. By 1952, according to his notes, he had successfully preserved the consciousness of 19 patients. 19 minds, separated from their bodies, existing in a kind of limbo state, aware but unable to communicate, unable to die, unable to do anything but exist in whatever nightmare existence he'd created for them. They are not ghosts, he'd written. Ghosts are superstition, fantasy. What I have created is something else entirely. Pure consciousness, stripped of physical form but retaining memory, personality, awareness. They exist in the spaces between, in the quantum foam that underlies reality. They are eternal. They are proof that death can be defeated. But something had gone wrong. In his final entries before the fire, Edmund's handwriting had become erratic, his notes more fragmented. He'd started to realize that the minds he'd trapped were suffering, that existence without form was a kind of torture he hadn't anticipated. They'd begun to communicate with him somehow, to influence the physical world around them, to make their pain known. "They're angry," one note read, dated July 1952, just a month before the fire. "I thought I was giving them immortality, but I've given them hell. They want release. They want to die properly. But I can't undo what I've done. The process is irreversible. They will exist forever, conscious and aware and suffering. God forgive me. God forgive us all." The final entry was dated August 11, 1952, the day before the fire. "They've learned to manipulate electrical systems, to influence temperature and pressure, to make themselves heard. Last night, every light in the asylum blazed at once. The walls shook, and I heard them, all 19 of them, screaming in a chorus that wasn't sound but was somehow louder than anything I've ever heard. They're going to break free. They're going to burn this place down with all of us inside it. And perhaps that's what we deserve. Perhaps that's justice. I tried to defeat death, and instead I created something worse. An eternity of imprisonment. An existence of pure suffering. I am not a scientist. I am a monster. And monsters must burn." The fire had come the next night. 20 people had died. The 19 patients whose consciousness Edmund had trapped. Their bodies had long since been buried, plus Edmund himself. Together, they made up the 20 victims mentioned in the newspaper article about the night staff who'd been unable to escape. But the basement had survived. The resonance chambers had survived. And the 19 minds, still trapped, still suffering, were sealed beneath the rubble. Helena had inherited this knowledge along with her grandfather's estate. She'd discovered his notes, his equipment, his terrible legacy. And instead of exposing it, instead of tearing it all down and releasing whatever was trapped there, she'd chosen to contain it. Had built a house on top of the ruins, had reinforced the basement, had tried to make sure no one else would ever stumble upon what Edmund had created. Margot understood now why Helena couldn't leave. It wasn't just the house holding her. It was guilt. The knowledge that she was responsible for keeping 19 tortured minds imprisoned. The weight of her grandfather's sins transferred to her shoulders. She'd spent her entire adult life as a warden, keeping watch over a prison of consciousness and suffering. And now that role has passed to Margot. But Margot wasn't Helena. She wasn't willing to spend the next 36 years maintaining a seal on someone else's torture. If there was a way to end this, to finally give those trapped minds the death they'd been denied, she would find it. She'd found something in Edmund's notes. Possibility. He'd written about it in his final days, when he'd realized the horror of what he'd created. The resonance chambers were designed to trap and preserve consciousness, but they operated on a principle of coherence. The electrical patterns had to remain stable, had to maintain their organization. If that coherence could be disrupted, if the patterns could be scattered beyond the point of recovery, the consciousness would dissipate, would finally truly die. Edmund had designed a failsafe, a way to shut down all the resonance chambers at once, to overload them with electromagnetic pulses that would scramble the patterns beyond repair. But he'd never used it, had died before he could make that choice. And Helena, reading his notes, had been too afraid to try it. Too afraid of what might happen if she failed, if she only partially disrupted the patterns and made things worse. Margot looked at the schematic Edmund had drawn. The control panel was in the basement, in a room adjacent to the main resonance chamber. If she could find it, if it still functioned after all these years, she could end this. Could give those 19 minds the death they'd been begging for since 1952. But first she had to go down there, had to face whatever waited in the darkness, had to hear their stories, understand who they'd been before Edmund had stolen their deaths from them. The sun had set completely now. The house was growing dark, shadows pooling in corners and doorways. Margot gathered her supplies, flashlights, batteries, the schematic, a copy of the list she'd found of the 19 names. People who'd been patients at Ashwood. People who'd trusted doctors to help them and had been betrayed in the worst way imaginable. She stood at the basement door, her hand on the knob, and felt the full weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't explored. This wasn't research. This was a confrontation. This was walking into a prison full of tortured minds and telling them she was going to set them free. If they believed her, if they didn't tear her apart first. She opened the door and descended into the darkness. The basement was colder than it had been earlier, cold enough that her breath came out in clouds. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the same rough stone walls, the same old pipes and electrical conduits. But something was different. The air felt charged, electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm. And she could feel them now. Feel the presence of the 19 minds, aware and watching and waiting to see what she would do. The iron-banded door stood open, just as she'd left it. Beyond it, the darkness seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Margot forced herself forward, through the doorway, into the corridor that led deeper into the earth. The walls here were different, covered in copper plating, with wires running along the ceiling and floor in intricate patterns. This was Edmund's work, the infrastructure of his resonance chambers. The copper conducted and amplified the electrical patterns, creating a kind of web that could capture and hold consciousness. Margot followed the corridor, her footsteps echoing off stone. The air grew colder with each step, and the feeling of being watched intensified. She could almost hear them now. Not voices exactly, but something like voices, whispers that existed at the edge of perception. The corridor opened into a large chamber, and Margot stopped, her flashlight beam sweeping across a space that took her breath away. It was enormous, at least 40 feet across, with a domed ceiling covered in more copper plating and wires. Around the walls were alcoves, 19 of them, she counted, each one containing what looked like a hospital bed, though the beds were unlike any she'd ever seen. They were made of metal and glass, with wires attached to frames that would have held a patient's head, with equipment surrounding them that looked like a nightmarish combination of medical equipment and electrical apparatus. This was where Edmund had done it, where he'd killed his patients and trapped their minds, where he'd committed his greatest crime in the name of defeating death. And in the center of the chamber, standing perfectly still, was a woman. Margot's scream caught in her throat. The woman was pale, almost translucent in the flashlight beam, wearing what looked like a hospital gown from the 1950s. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her eyes were wrong somehow, too dark, too deep, like looking into wells that had no bottom. "You came," the woman said, and her voice was the same voice Margot had heard earlier, old and cracked and full of pain. "Helena sent you." Margot's hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the flashlight steady. Are you real?" The woman smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of sorrow and resignation. "Real? I don't know anymore. I was real once. My name was Elizabeth Warren. I was 23 years old when Dr. Voss admitted me to Ashwood. That was in 1949. I was depressed, they said, melancholic. My husband thought a few weeks in a sanitarium would help. Instead, I became one of Edmund's experiments." She moved closer, and Margot could see through her. Not completely, but enough to see the stone wall behind her. Enough to know that Elizabeth Warren wasn't solid, wasn't quite there. She was a pattern of electrical impulses given form, consciousness shaped into something that looked human but wasn't. "How?" Margot whispered. "How are you?" "Manifesting." Elizabeth's smile turned bitter. "We've had 73 years to learn. 73 years trapped in this place, unable to move on, unable to die, unable to do anything but exist and suffer. We've learned a lot about what we are, about what he made us." "We?" Margot looked around the chamber, and now she could see them. Faint outlines in the darkness, shapes that might have been people or might have been shadows. 18 others, she knew. 18 more minds trapped here with Elizabeth. "All of us," Elizabeth confirmed. "The 19 patients Edmund preserved. We're all here. We've always been here. Helena knew about us. She visited sometimes in the early years. She would sit at the top of the stairs and talk to us. Tell us she was sorry. Tell us she didn't know how to set us free." Margot felt tears burning in her eyes. "I found Edmund's notes. The failsafe. I think I can end this. I think I can let you die properly." Elizabeth stared at her for a long moment, and Margot could see something flickering in those two deep eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both. You would do that? Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper now. You would kill us? I would free you, Margot said. Isn't that what you want? To finally rest. Some of us, another voice said, and Margot turned to see a man stepping out of the shadows. He was younger than Elizabeth, maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair and eyes that held the same impossible depth. Some of us have been waiting for this for decades. We've been begging for it. But others are afraid, Elizabeth finished. We've existed like this for so long, we don't know what comes after. What if there's nothing? What if we dissipate into the void and that's all? At least here, trapped as we are, we still exist. We're still conscious. We're still ourselves, in some way. Margot felt her heart breaking. These people, these consciousnesses, these fragments of humanity, had been tortured for 7 decades, and they were afraid to die because they'd been trapped for so long they couldn't remember what it was like to not be trapped. Tell me your stories, she said, surprising herself. All of you. Tell me who you were before Edmund did this to you. Help me understand. And they did. One by one, they came forward out of the shadows. 19 minds given temporary form through sheer force of will. They told her their names, their ages, how they'd come to be at Ashwood. Some had been sent by families who didn't know what else to do with them. Others had admitted themselves, seeking help for depression or anxiety or trauma. A few had been committed against their will, judged unstable by courts or doctors or spouses who wanted them gone. There was Elizabeth Warren, 23, who'd been sad after a miscarriage. Thomas Chen, and Margot's breath caught at the name, wondering if they were related, 37, who'd seen terrible things in World War II and couldn't sleep anymore. Sarah Mitchell, 41, who'd heard voices after her son died. David Park, 19, who'd tried to kill himself after his parents rejected him for being gay. Each story was a tragedy. Each one was a person who'd been failed by their society, by their families, by the medical establishment that was supposed to help them. And each one had been murdered by a man who thought he was doing something noble, something that would defeat death itself. By the time they'd all spoken, Margot was crying openly, tears streaming down her face. These weren't monsters. They weren't even ghosts in the traditional sense. They were victims, people who'd suffered in life and had had their death stolen from them, forced to exist in a state of perpetual awareness without the mercy of oblivion. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry Helena didn't free you when she had the chance. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to come who was willing to end it. It's not your fault, Elizabeth said gently. You didn't do this to us. You're just the one who inherited the burden of fixing it. Will it hurt? A small voice asked, and Margot saw a child stepping forward. A girl, maybe 8 years old, with blonde hair in braids. The sight of her. A child trapped here, a child who'd been experimented on and killed, made Margot feel physically sick. I don't know, Margot admitted. Edmund's notes said the disruption would be instantaneous. You should just cease. Stop existing. But I don't know if there will be pain. I don't know what it will feel like. The child, her name was Lucy. She'd been committed for epilepsy that her parents thought was demonic possession. Nodded slowly. That's okay. Anything is better than staying here forever. Even if it hurts, at least it will end. Not all of us agree, a man said, his voice hard. He stood at the back of the chamber, barely visible even with the flashlight pointed at him. Some of us think we should stay, that we should keep existing even like this, that giving up consciousness is the same as never having existed at all. Marcus, Elizabeth said, and there was warning in her tone. We've discussed this. We took a vote. 14-5. The majority wants release. Marcus, and Margot realized with a start that this must be a different Marcus, not Helena's husband, stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. You're condemning 5 of us to death against our will. How is that different from what Edmund did? It was a fair question. Terrible question. Margot looked at the schematic in her hands, at the failsafe that would disrupt all 19 resonance chambers at once. There was no way to target only some of them. If she did this, she would be killing all 19 consciousness, including the 5 who wanted to continue existing. What if? She started, then stopped, thinking. What if there was a way to separate you? To move the 5 of you who want to stay to a different location before I activate the failsafe? There's no way to do that, Thomas said quietly. We're bound to this place, to the copper wiring and the resonance chambers. We can manifest, can appear to have form, but we can't actually leave. The farthest we can go is the ground floor of the house, and even that takes enormous effort. Margot's mind was racing. There had to be a solution. There had to be a way to give both groups what they wanted. Freedom for those who sought it, continued existence for those who needed it. And then she remembered something from Edmund's notes. Something about transferring consciousness, about moving the electrical patterns from one resonance chamber to another. He theorized that if he could perfect the technique, he could move a trapped consciousness into a new body, and could achieve true immortality by jumping from one physical form to another. He'd never perfected it. But maybe the partial technique was enough. Maybe she could move the 5 who wanted to stay to a smaller, isolated resonance chamber before destroying the main one. I think there might be a way, she said slowly, but it would require building a new chamber, smaller, portable, something that could sustain 5 consciousness indefinitely. I'd need equipment, materials, time. Could take weeks, months, even. We've waited 73 years, Elizabeth said. Those who want to continue existing can wait a few more months. The question is, will you do it? Will you take on that responsibility? Building a new prison, even a voluntary one. Margot closed her eyes, thinking about what that would mean. She would have to stay here, would have to live in this house and work on creating a sustainable trap for 5 human consciousness. Would have to become what Helena had been, a warden, a keeper of the dead. But it was the right thing to do. It was the only ethical choice. She couldn't force death on consciousness that wanted to continue existing, no matter how trapped they were. Yes, she said, opening her eyes. I'll do it. I'll build you a new chamber, something better than this. Something that doesn't require you to be trapped in the ruins of an asylum. And once it's ready, I'll transfer the 5 who want to stay, and I'll free the rest of you. The relief in the chamber was palpable, like a physical weight lifting. The 14 who wanted to die seemed to brighten, their forms becoming more solid, more real. And the 5 who wanted to continue existing, Marcus and 4 others, nodded slowly, accepting the compromise. Thank you, Elizabeth said, and Margot could hear tears in her voice. Even though she wasn't sure consciousness without bodies could cry. Thank you for caring, for listening, for treating us like people instead of problems to be solved. You are people, Margot said firmly. What Edmund did to you doesn't change that. You're still people, and you deserve dignity and choice and respect. They talked for hours after that, working out the details, making plans. Margot would need to return to Seattle, would need to research the equipment she'd need, would need to figure out how to build a modern resonance chamber that was sustainable and humane. It would require learning electrical engineering, quantum mechanics, neuroscience, all the fields Edmund had pioneered in his twisted way. But she would do it. She had to. These 19 consciousness, these people, had been failed by everyone who'd encountered them for 73 years. She wouldn't be another person who walked away. As dawn approached, Margot climbed back up the stairs, exhausted but determined. The house felt different now that she understood what it contained. Not haunted exactly, but inhabited, full of awareness and suffering and hope. Helena had tried to contain it, to seal it away and pretend it didn't exist. But containment wasn't the answer. Understanding was the answer. Compassion was the answer. Giving people, even people who existed only as electrical patterns in copper wire, the dignity of choice and the respect of being heard. Margot stood in the kitchen as the sun rose, light streaming through the windows and touching the walls of the house that was now truly hers. She had a plan. She had a purpose. And she had 19 souls counting on her to give them what Edmund and Helena never could. Freedom, one way or another. It would take time. It would take work. It would probably take every resource she had and then some. But she would do it. because someone had to, because the dead deserved better. And because Margot Chen, broke and desperate and braver than she'd ever known, was finally ready to be the person Helena had believed she could be. The house settled around her with a sound like a sigh, and in the basement, 19 consciousness waited with something they hadn't felt in 73 years. Hope. 3 months later, Margot sat at the kitchen table surrounded by circuit boards, copper wire, and books with titles like Quantum Coherence in Biological Systems and Electromagnetic Field Theory for Engineers. Her laptop displayed complex schematics she'd spent weeks learning to understand, and her hands were scarred with small burns from soldering mistakes. She looked like hell, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing the same sweatshirt she'd worn for 3 days straight, but she'd never felt more alive. The transition from unemployed graphic designer to amateur quantum engineer had been brutal. She'd spent the first week after her revelation in the basement just trying to understand Edmund's notes, translating his archaic terminology into modern concepts, cross-referencing his theories with current neuroscience. She'd reached out to professors at the University of Washington, carefully framing her questions as theoretical research for a novel she was writing. She'd haunted online forums about electromagnetic theory and consciousness studies, absorbing information like a sponge. And slowly, painfully, she'd begun to understand not just what Edmund had done, but how he'd done it, and how she could do it better. The original resonance chambers were crude by modern standards, copper plating and wire, basic electromagnetic coils, equipment that generated the right frequencies through brute force. They worked, but they were inefficient and required enormous amounts of space and energy. What Margot was designing was something different, a compact, self-sustaining system that could maintain 5 consciousness indefinitely using modern superconductors and quantum processors. She'd had to sell everything she owned to fund the project. Her car, her furniture, every possession she'd brought from Seattle. She'd maxed out her credit cards ordering specialized equipment from overseas suppliers who asked no questions. The house had electricity now. She'd had the power reconnected and the bill was astronomical, but it was necessary. She needed to run simulations to test components to make sure that when she finally attempted the transfer, everything would work perfectly. Because she would only get one chance. The consciousness trapped in the basement were fragile, despite having survived for decades. The transfer process would stress their coherence patterns, would risk disrupting them beyond recovery. If she made a mistake, if any single component failed, she could accidentally destroy all 19 minds instead of just freeing 14 of them. The pressure was immense. Some nights she woke up gasping, dreaming of failed transfers and minds screaming as they dissipated into nothing. Other nights she didn't sleep at all, just worked through until dawn, triple-checking her calculations, running another simulation, soldering another connection. But she wasn't alone. The 19 had become her companions, her advisors, her friends. Elizabeth visited most often, manifesting in the kitchen while Margot worked, offering encouragement and perspective. Thomas would appear to discuss the ethical implications of what she was doing, the philosophy of consciousness and existence and choice. Even Marcus, who'd been hostile at first, had warmed to her, offering insights from his own experience of existing without form. And Lucy, the 8-year-old girl who'd been trapped here since 1951, had adopted Margot completely. She would appear in the evenings, asking Margot to read to her from the books in the library, wanting to know about the world outside, about what had changed in the 73 years since she'd died. Margot had cried the first time Lucy had asked if there was a cure for epilepsy now, if other children like her didn't have to be locked away and experimented on. "There's a cure," Margot had said, her voice breaking. "Well, not a cure exactly, but treatments. Medications that control seizures. And no one thinks it's demonic possession anymore. You would have been fine, Lucy. You would have lived a normal life." Lucy had been quiet for a long time after that. Then she'd said, in a voice so small Margot barely heard it, "I'm glad other children don't have to go through what I did. Even if I didn't get to live, I'm glad the world got better." It was conversations like that that kept Margot going when the work seemed impossible, when the calculations wouldn't balance, when the equipment failed for the 3rd time in a row. These weren't abstract problems she was solving. They were people counting on her. people who deserved better than what they'd gotten. She'd also started documenting everything. Not just the technical work, but the stories. She'd set up a camera in the basement and recorded interviews with each of the 19, asking them about their lives, their memories, what they wanted people to know. It had started as a way to preserve their histories before they were gone. But it had become something more, a testimony, a record of Edmund Voss's crimes and the price of his ambition. She planned to release the recordings after she'd freed the 14 who wanted to die. The world needed to know what had happened here, needed to understand the dangers of treating consciousness as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be respected. Edmund had thought he was defeating death, but he'd only created a new kind of torture. That lesson needed to be remembered. Emma had called twice during these 3 months. The first time, Margot had been so deep in calculations she'd barely registered her sister's voice, had mumbled something about being busy and hung up. The second time, Emma had been worried, asking if Margot was okay, if she needed help, if she was having some kind of breakdown. "I'm fine," Margot had said, and it was the truth. "I'm better than fine. I'm doing something that matters. Something important. Living alone in a creepy mansion in the woods doing God knows what?" Emma had replied. "That's not healthy, Margot. That's how horror movies start." Margot had laughed, but it was a tired sound. "You're not wrong, but I can't explain it, not yet. Just trust me. Okay? When this is done, when I can tell you everything, you'll understand." Emma had reluctantly agreed, but Margot could hear the concern in her voice. She made a mental note to call her sister more often, to remember that she had a life outside this house, outside this mission. But that was for later. Right now, the work is everything. The prototype chamber was nearly complete. It sat in what had once been the conservatory, a sleek cylinder about 4 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter, covered in panels that hummed with electromagnetic coils and quantum processors. It looked nothing like Edmund's crude copper alcoves. It was beautiful, actually, in a technical way, like a piece of modern art that just happened to be capable of sustaining human consciousness. Margot had tested it extensively with simulated patterns, with recordings of brain activity from public databases, with every parameter she could think of. And every simulation had worked perfectly. The chamber could maintain stable coherence patterns indefinitely, could provide the consciousness inside with sensory input through neural interface protocols she'd adapted from cutting-edge prosthetics research, could even allow them to communicate with the outside world through text-to-speech systems. It would be a better existence than the basement. Not freedom exactly, but at least it would be a cage with windows, a prison where the inmates could still participate in the world. Marcus had been skeptical at first, but when she'd shown him the designs, when she'd explained how the consciousness in the new chamber would be able to access the internet, to read and learn and even communicate with people online, he'd softened. "It's not life," he'd said, "but it's not torture either. The something in between. Something we can work with." The day of the transfer came on a Tuesday, which seemed somehow fitting. Margot woke before dawn, her stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. She'd gone over the procedure 1,000 times, had checked every connection, every calculation, every possible failure point. But there was still so much that could go wrong. She dressed carefully, putting on clothes that felt appropriate for what she was about to do. Dark jeans, a button-down shirt, boots that would protect her feet in the basement. She pulled her hair back and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked older than 29, harder and more certain. This was what responsibility looked like, she thought. This was what it meant to carry someone else's burden and choose to bear it anyway. The 19 were waiting in the basement when she descended. All of them were manifesting, their forms more solid than she'd ever seen them, as if they were putting all their energy into being present for this moment. "Are you ready?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite what Margot could see was enormous emotional weight. "As ready as I'll ever be," Margot replied. She set down the portable chamber, which she'd modified with handles so she could carry it. The 5 who were staying, Marcus, Jennifer, Robert, Alice, and James, "I need you to come forward." The 5 stepped out from the group, and Margot could see the mix of emotions on their faces. Relief that they wouldn't be forced to die. Guilt that they were choosing to continue while others ended. fear about what this new existence would be like. I want you to know, Margot said, addressing all 19 of them, that there's no wrong choice here. The 14 who are choosing to end their existence, you're not giving up. You're not cowards. You've endured 73 years of imprisonment and suffering. You've earned rest. And the 5 who are choosing to continue, you're not being selfish. You're not betraying anyone. You have the right to exist, to continue experiencing consciousness, no matter what form it takes. We know, Elizabeth said gently. We've made our peace with each other. We've said our goodbyes. We're ready. Margot nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She activated the portable chamber, watching as the displays lit up, showing stable electromagnetic fields and quantum coherence patterns waiting to be filled. Then she connected it to the main resonance chamber through a series of cables she'd carefully shielded and grounded. This is going to feel strange, she said to the 5. I'm essentially copying your consciousness patterns and transferring them to the new chamber. It should take about 30 seconds per person. You might feel a kind of pulling sensation or a sense of being in 2 places at once. Try not to resist it. Let the patterns flow. She started with Marcus since he'd been the most skeptical and she wanted him to go first to ease the way for the others. She initiated the transfer sequence, watching the monitors as his coherence patterns began to replicate, streaming through the cables into the new chamber. Marcus's form in the basement flickered, became translucent, then solidified again. And in the portable chamber, a new presence appeared, visible on the monitors as stable patterns of electromagnetic activity. It worked! Marcus's voice came through the chamber's speaker system, sounding amazed. I can feel it. I'm in both places, like I'm standing in 2 rooms at once. That's normal, Margot said, checking the readings. When I activate the failsafe and destroy the original chamber, the copy in the basement will dissipate and you'll only exist in the new one. But for now, you're essentially duplicated. She transferred the other 4, one by one, watching as their patterns replicated successfully, as the portable chamber filled with 5 stable consciousnesses. Jennifer wept, or did whatever crying looked like for a consciousness without tears. Robert kept saying, "Thank you," over and over. Alice was silent, but Margot could see her form glowing brighter in the new chamber, as if she was already exploring its capabilities. James, the youngest of the 5 at 17 when he died, laughed with relief. When all 5 were successfully transferred, Margot disconnected the cables and moved the portable chamber to the far side of the basement, as far from the main resonance chamber as possible. She wanted to make sure the electromagnetic pulse from the failsafe wouldn't affect them. I'm going to activate it now, she said, her voice shaking slightly. The 14 of you who are ending, is there anything you want to say? Anything you need? Lucy came forward first. She looked so real, so solid, that Margot could almost believe she was actually alive. Tell people what happened to us, the little girl said. Don't let them forget. Don't let Edmund's crimes disappear into history. I won't, Margot promised. The whole world will know your story. And tell my parents I forgive them, Lucy continued. They thought they were helping me. They didn't know what would happen. I don't want them to have died thinking I hated them. Margot's vision blurred with tears. Your parents are long gone, sweetie, but I'll find out where they're buried and I'll leave them a message. I'll make sure they know. One by one, the others came forward with their final words. Thomas asked her to donate money to veterans' mental health services, using whatever funds came from selling the house eventually. Sarah wanted her sister's descendants found and told them that she'd always loved them. David asked Margot to volunteer at an LGBTQ+ youth center to help kids who were struggling like he'd struggled. Elizabeth came last. Live, she said simply. Live fully and freely and don't waste a single day. That's what we lost. That's what Edmund stole from us. So live enough for all of us. Okay? I will, Margot whispered. I promise. She moved to the control panel Edmund had built, the failsafe system that had waited for 73 years to be activated. The switches were old, but they still functioned, and the capacitors Edmund had installed were still holding charge. It would work. It had to work. Margot took a deep breath and looked at the 14 consciousness gathered before her. They looked peaceful, she thought. Ready. After decades of suffering, they'd finally found their way to the end. Thank you, she said, for trusting me, for being patient with me, for teaching me what courage really means. You're all extraordinary, and I'm honored to have known you. We're the ones who should thank you, Elizabeth said, and the others nodded in agreement. You came here, you listened, you cared. That's more than anyone else ever did for us. Margot placed her hands on the switches. I'm going to count down from 3. When I reach 0, I'll activate the failsafe. You should just stop. There shouldn't be pain. Just peace. Finally. She saw Lucy reach out and take Elizabeth's hand. Saw Thomas put his arm around Sarah's shoulders. Saw all 14 of them draw together, supporting each other in these final moments. 3, Margot said, tears streaming down her face. 2. The consciousness in the basement began to glow, brighter and brighter, their forms becoming almost solid, as if they were using every last bit of energy to be fully present for this. 1. Margot threw the switches. The electromagnetic pulse was silent, but she felt it. A wave of energy that swept through the basement like a wind. The copper plating on the walls sparked and crackled. The lights flickered, and the 14 consciousness in the center of the chamber blazed like stars for one perfect moment. Then they were gone. Simply gone. No screams, no struggling, no signs of pain. They just ceased to exist, their coherence patterns scrambled beyond recovery, their consciousness finally, mercifully released from its prison. The basement was silent, empty. For the first time in 73 years, there was no awareness in the main resonance chamber. No trapped minds suffering in the darkness. Just copper wire and stone and the echoes of what had been. Margot collapsed to her knees, sobbing. It was done. They were free. 14 souls who'd been imprisoned since the Truman administration were finally at rest. Behind her, from the portable chamber, she heard Marcus's voice. Are they? They're gone, Margot said, wiping her eyes. They're free. It's over. The 5 consciousnesses in the portable chamber were quiet for a long time. Then Jennifer spoke, her voice soft. Thank you for giving all of us what we needed, for not forcing us to choose the same thing, for respecting our autonomy. Margot stood on shaking legs and moved to the portable chamber. I'm going to take you upstairs now. We'll set you up in the library, I think, where you can access books, the internet, where you can watch the world through the windows. It won't be freedom, but it'll be better than the basement, Marcus finished. It'll be better than what we had. And who knows? Maybe someday someone will figure out how to give us bodies, how to really set us free. Until then, we'll wait. We're good at waiting. Margot carefully lifted the chamber, cradling it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. It held 5 human consciousnesses, 5 people who'd chosen to continue existing against all odds, who'd decided that consciousness, even consciousness without form, was worth preserving. She carried them upstairs, into the library with its thousands of books and its tall windows overlooking the forest. She set up the chamber on the desk, connected it to the house's power and internet, configured the interfaces that would let them read and communicate and experience the world in whatever limited way they could. It's not much, she said, looking at the chamber sitting on the desk, humming quietly. But it's yours, for as long as you want it. It's everything, Alice said, her voice coming through the speaker. It's choice. It's dignity. It's being treated like people instead of problems. Thank you, Margot. Thank you for seeing us. Margot stayed in the library with them for hours, helping them learn to use the interfaces, showing them how to access news sites and social media and all the wonders of the internet. They were like children with a new toy, marveling at how much the world had changed, at all the information available at their fingertips. When she finally left them to explore on their own, the sun was setting. Margot walked through the house that had seemed so threatening 3 months ago and felt its transformation. It wasn't a prison anymore. It wasn't a monument to Edmund Voss's crimes. It was a home, her home, and a sanctuary for 5 consciousnesses who'd chosen to remain. She made her way to the 3rd floor, to the hidden door she'd never opened. The door with the warning carved above it. She'd been so afraid of it when she'd first found it, had thought it held some terrible secret, some horror that would destroy her. But now she understood. The door didn't lead to anything supernatural or monstrous. It led to Edmund's private study, the room where he'd kept his most detailed notes, his most damning evidence. Helena had sealed it not because of what was behind it, but because opening it would force someone to confront the full truth of what her grandfather had done. Margot didn't need to open it now. She'd already found the truth in the basement, in the journals, in the stories of the 19 consciousness who'd lived through Edmund's experiments. The door could stay closed. Some secrets didn't need to be revealed. Some horrors didn't need to be witnessed firsthand. She went downstairs to the kitchen and made herself real tea, brewed in Helena's old kettle on the gas stove. She sat at the table and pulled out her phone, opening the file where she'd been keeping notes about everything that had happened. She would write it all down, would document Edmund's crimes, Helena's choices, her own decisions, would tell the stories of 19 people who'd had their deaths stolen and their suffering prolonged beyond all reason. And when it was done, when the book was written and published, the world would know, would understand the price of treating consciousness as a commodity, of pursuing immortality without considering the cost. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, she was just going to sit in her house, in the home she'd earned through 3 months of brutal work and ethical choices, and be at peace. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Haven't heard from you in weeks. Getting worried. Call me?" Margot smiled and hit the call button. When her sister answered, she heard the relief in her voice. "Margot, finally. I was about to drive up there and check on you." "I'm okay," Margot said, and it was true. "I'm better than okay. I finished the project I was working on. It went well. Really well. Are you going to tell me what you've been doing up there?" "Soon," Margot promised. "I'll explain everything soon. But for now, just know that I'm happy. I'm doing something meaningful. And I'm not running away from life anymore. I'm running towards something better." They talked for an hour, about nothing and everything, about Emma's travels and Margot's plans and the strange journey that had brought her to this house in the mountains. When they finally hung up, Margot felt more connected to the world than she had in months. She walked to the library to check on the 5. Their consciousness was glowing softly in the chamber, and she could see on the monitor that they were engaged in a video call with each other, talking and laughing, or doing whatever consciousness did that approximated laughter. "Good night," she said to the chamber. "I'm going to bed. Let me know if you need anything." "Good night, Margot," they chorused back. "And thank you for everything." She climbed the stairs to the bedroom she'd claimed as her own. Helena's old room, actually, with its 4-poster bed and balcony overlooking the forest. She stood on the balcony for a moment, looking out at the trees silhouetted against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there were the ruins of Ashwood Psychiatric Hospital, overgrown and forgotten. Somewhere in the house's foundation were the copper wires and resonance chambers that had held 19 minds prisoner for 7 decades. And in the library below her were 5 consciousnesses who'd chosen to keep existing, who'd decided that life, or whatever this was worth preserving. Margot had freed 14 souls and given 5 others a choice. She'd honored Helena's legacy while correcting her mistakes. She'd taken responsibility for someone else's crimes and found a way to make them right. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. But it was justice of a kind. It was compassion. It was the best she could do with an impossible situation. And as she climbed into bed and finally let herself rest, Margot Chen felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride, purpose, peace. She had inherited an abandoned mansion and found a secret no one dared to open. And instead of running, instead of sealing it away like Helena had done, she'd opened it wide, had faced the truth head-on, had given the trapped and suffering what they'd been denied for decades. Freedom, or at least the next best thing. Tomorrow she would start writing the book. Would begin the process of telling the world what had happened here. Would take the first steps toward ensuring that Edmund Voss's crimes were never forgotten and never repeated. But tonight she slept, deeply and peacefully, in a house that was no longer haunted by the dead, just inhabited by the living, all of them in their own ways finally free. 5 years had passed since that Tuesday when Margot had activated Edmund Voss's failsafe and freed 14 trapped souls. 5 years since she'd made the choice to preserve 5 others in a chamber of her own design. 5 years since she'd transformed from a broke, directionless graphic designer into something else entirely. A guardian, a documentarian, a bridge between the living and the dead. The house on Ashwood Lane looked different now. Not physically, though Margot had made repairs and improvements where they were needed. But it felt different, carried itself differently in the clearing where it sat. There was light in the windows at night. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Cars came and went on the gravel driveway, not many, but enough to show that the house was lived in, was part of the world again instead of sealed off from it. Margot stood on the front porch in the cool October morning, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the mist rise from the forest. She was 34 now, and the years had changed her in ways both visible and invisible. There were threads of gray in her dark hair, lines around her eyes from squinting at technical diagrams and late-night reading. But she stood straighter than she had at 29, moved with the confidence of someone who'd faced impossible choices and come through them intact. The book had been published 3 years ago. The Ashwood Experiments, Consciousness, Crime, and the Cost of Immortality had started as a small academic press release and had become something more. A bestseller, a catalyst for discussions about the ethics of consciousness research, a warning about what happened when science abandoned humanity in pursuit of breakthrough discoveries. Margot had told Edmund's story with unflinching detail, had described his grief over Catherine's death, his descent into obsession, his gradual transformation from doctor to murderer. She told Helena's story too, the burden of inherited guilt, the decades of isolation, the impossible position of trying to contain horror while being consumed by it. And most importantly, she told the stories of the 19, who they'd been before Ashwood, what had been stolen from them, how they'd endured 7 decades of imprisonment. The reception had been mixed. Some people had praised her courage in revealing the truth, had called for investigations into other historical asylums, and had pushed for new regulations around consciousness research as neuroscience and artificial intelligence advanced. Others had accused her of fabrication, had said it was impossible for consciousness to exist without biological substrate, and had dismissed the whole thing as an elaborate hoax. But Margot had proof. She had Edmund's notes, Helena's journals, and the equipment in the basement. And she had the 5 Marcus, Jennifer, Robert, Alice, and James who could demonstrate their existence, could communicate with researchers, could prove that consciousness was more flexible and more mysterious than most people wanted to believe. The scientific community had descended on Ashwood Lane like locusts. Neuroscientists, quantum physicists, philosophers of mind, AI researchers, all of them wanting to study the 5, to understand how consciousness could persist without biological form. Margot had been careful about who she allowed access, protective of her 5 charges. But she'd permitted some studies, some experiments, as long as they were ethical and the 5 consented to them. The research had been revolutionary. Marcus, Jennifer, Robert, Alice, and James had become the most studied consciousness in human history. Papers had been published, careers had been made, entire new fields of study had opened up. And through it all, the 5 had maintained their dignity, had insisted on being treated as people rather than specimens, and had used their unique position to advocate for ethical treatment of all forms of consciousness, biological, artificial, or otherwise. Jennifer had become an activist, using text-to-speech interfaces to give talks at universities and conferences about disability rights and the definition of personhood. Robert had taken up philosophy, engaging in debates with prominent thinkers about the nature of existence and whether suffering was necessary for authentic consciousness. Alice had started writing poetry that had been published in prestigious literary journals, her unique perspective on existence creating a new genre critics called post-corporeal literature. James, still 17 in his thoughts if not his years, had enrolled in online college courses, was working toward a degree in psychology, and wanted to understand the mechanisms of his own existence. And Marcus had become Margot's partner in managing the house, in coordinating research visits, in making sure that Ashwood Lane remained a place of learning and healing rather than another site of exploitation. They'd become her family, in a way. Strange and unconventional, yes. She sometimes had to explain to confused delivery drivers that no, There weren't 5 other people living in the house with her, just 5 consciousnesses in a portable quantum chamber in the library. But family nonetheless. People she cared about, who cared about her, who'd built a life together in whatever way consciousness without bodies could build lives. The house had become more than a home. It was a research center, a museum, a memorial. Margot had converted the 3rd floor into a proper archive, had organized all of Edmund's notes and Helena's journals into a comprehensive collection that scholars could access by appointment. The basement had been sealed off. She'd filled in Edmund's resonance chambers with concrete after removing the 5, had marked the site with a plaque listing the names of the 19 who'd been imprisoned there. She'd found graves for most of them, had worked with genealogists to track down descendants, had made sure that each of the 14 who'd chosen to end their existence was properly memorialized. Lucy's parents were buried in a cemetery 2 towns over, and Margot visited twice a year to leave flowers and a note saying that Lucy had forgiven them, that she'd understood they'd been trying to help. The conservatory had been transformed into something beautiful. A greenhouse full of plants and light, with the portable chamber sitting on a pedestal in the center like a modern sculpture. The 5 could see everything from there, could watch the seasons change through the glass walls, could observe the birds and squirrels that came to investigate. It wasn't the same as having bodies, as being able to walk outside and feel the sun. But it was better than the basement. It was better than nothing. Margot heard the crunch of tires on gravel and turned to see a familiar car pulling up the driveway. Emma's rental. Her sister visited every few months now, had forgiven Margot for the secretiveness of those first months once she'd understood what was at stake. The driver's door opened and Emma emerged, followed by a young man Margot recognized as Emma's fiancé, David. "Margot," Emma called, waving enthusiastically. She looked good, tanned and happy, her blonde hair caught back in a ponytail. "We brought groceries, and David's been dying to meet the 5. I've told him so much about them." Margot smiled and walked down the porch steps to help unload bags. "They'll be thrilled." Marcus has been practicing his stand-up routine. He's determined to make people laugh despite not having a body. "How's that going?" Emma asked, pulling her sister into a hug. "Terribly," Margot admitted. "But we all laugh anyway because his confidence is admirable." They carried the groceries inside, David looking around with wide eyes at the grand foyer, the portraits, the sweeping staircase. "This place is incredible," he said. "I mean, Emma showed me pictures, but seeing it in person, wow." "Wait until you see the library," Margot said. "And meet the 5. They're expecting you. Fair warning, though, Jennifer's going to ask you about your dissertation. She's been following your research online and has thoughts." David looked delighted rather than intimidated. As a graduate student studying consciousness and artificial intelligence, the opportunity to interact with the 5 was apparently a dream come true. Margot led them to the conservatory, where afternoon light was streaming through the glass walls. The portable chamber hummed softly on its pedestal, surrounded by plants and comfortable chairs Margot had arranged for visitors. The display screens showed the 5's consciousness as patterns of light and color, dancing and shifting in ways that suggested conversation. "Everyone," Margot announced. "This is David, Emma's fiancé." "Welcome," came the chorus of voices from the chamber's speakers, slightly distorted but warm and genuine. Jennifer's voice took the lead. "We've been looking forward to meeting you. Your paper on emergent consciousness in neural networks was fascinating, though I have some critiques about your methodology." David laughed nervously but was already pulling out a notebook. "I'd love to hear them, and I have so many questions for all of you, if you're willing to talk about your experiences." "We're always willing," Marcus said dryly. "We have literally nothing but time." The conversation flowed easily from there, David asking questions and the 5 responding with the kind of insight that only came from decades of existing in a state most people couldn't imagine. Margot and Emma retreated to the kitchen to prepare lunch, leaving David to his enthusiastic interview. "He's going to talk their ears off," Emma said, chopping vegetables. "If they had ears." "They don't mind," Margot assured her. "They like having visitors who see them as people rather than phenomena. Plus, Jennifer really does have thoughts about his methodology. She's been taking online courses in AI ethics. says it's important that artificial consciousness isn't treated the way they were. Emma was quiet for a moment, her knife pausing mid-chop. Do you ever regret it, taking this on? You could have just walked away from all of it. Margot considered the question. It wasn't the first time someone had asked her. No, she said finally. I mean, it's hard sometimes. The responsibility, the attention, the fact that I can never really leave because the five need someone to maintain their chamber and advocate for them. But I've done something meaningful here. I've given people peace, preserved others who wanted to continue existing, exposed crimes that needed exposing. How many people get to say their life had that kind of impact? You gave up a lot though, Emma said gently. Relationships, privacy, the chance to just be normal. I was never going to be normal, Margot laughed. And honestly, I'm happier now than I ever was before. I have a purpose. I have 5. I have this house and this work. I have you. Visiting regularly and bringing your lovely fiancé to meet my quantum-imprisoned friends. Emma snorted. Only you could make quantum-imprisoned friends sound like a normal thing to have. They finished preparing lunch and called everyone to the dining room. A grand space Margot rarely used for its intended purpose anymore, but Emma loved eating here when she visited. David came with his notebook full of scribbled notes, looking dazed and excited. That was incredible, he kept saying. The way they think about consciousness, about existence, it's completely unique. Jennifer said she'd be willing to collaborate on a paper about the ethical implications of consciousness transfer if I wanted. Can you imagine? Co-authoring with someone who exists as pure electromagnetic patterns. Welcome to my world, Margot said, amused, where the impossible is just Tuesday. After lunch, Emma and David went for a walk in the forest. Emma wanted to show him the ruins of the old asylum that were still visible if you knew where to look. Margot returned to the conservatory to check on the 5. He's enthusiastic, Alice observed. Reminds me of James when he first started his courses. That hunger to understand everything. He's good for Emma, Margot said, settling into one of the chairs. She needs someone who can handle the strangeness of her sister, living with 5 consciousness, in a mansion built on an asylum. You make it sound so dramatic when you put it that way, James said. We're actually pretty normal once you get to know us. Sure, Margot agreed. Totally normal. Just disembodied minds existing in a quantum chamber. Nothing weird about that at all. They laughed together, or rather, the 5 generated sounds that approximated laughter through the speakers while Margot laughed naturally. It was these moments that made everything worthwhile. The easy companionship, the jokes, the sense of being part of something larger than herself. I got an email from the publisher, Margot said, shifting to business. They want to do a 5-year anniversary edition of the book. New forward, updated information about the research that's come from studying you 5. Are you all okay with that? As long as we can contribute, Jennifer said. I'd like to write an essay about how consciousness research has progressed in the last 5 years. How we've gone from being impossible to being simply unlikely. I think that would be perfect, Margot agreed. She made a note to follow up with the publisher about including essays from the 5 themselves. Any other thoughts? Updates you'd like to see included? Something about the legal battle, Marcus suggested. The one about whether we count as persons under the law. That's still ongoing, right? Margot grimaced. It was one of the more frustrating aspects of her role as the 5's guardian. Still ongoing. The court system doesn't know what to do with you. You're not alive in the traditional sense, but you're clearly conscious and capable of making decisions. Some judges want to grant you legal personhood. Others think it would set a dangerous precedent for AI rights. Which it should, Robert said firmly. That's exactly why it matters. If consciousness can exist without biological substrate, then we need to fundamentally rethink how we define personhood and rights. We're the test case. What happens to us will determine how artificial consciousness is treated in the future. I know, Margot said, and I'm fighting for you. We all are. But the law moves slowly. They talked for another hour about various legal and ethical issues, about research proposals that had come in, about practical matters like upgrading the chamber's hardware and expanding its sensory input capabilities. It was the kind of conversation Margot never could have imagined having 5 years ago. But now it was routine. Her life had become a strange blend of technology management, ethical philosophy, historical preservation, and family care. When Emma and David returned from their walk, they found Margot in Helena's old office, which had become Margot's office, working on her laptop. She was drafting an article about consciousness research ethics for a scientific journal, one of the many ways she tried to influence the field to prevent future Ashwood-style atrocities. "We should get going," Emma said, leaning against the doorframe. "Long drive back to Seattle. But dinner next month? You could come to the city, stay with us for a few days. Get away from the house." Margot glanced at her calendar, mental and digital. "I can probably do that. I'd need to make sure someone could check on the 5 while I'm gone." "We'll be fine." Marcus's voice came through the intercom system Margot had installed throughout the house, so the 5 could communicate from any room. "You mother hen us too much. Go have a life." "See," Emma said. "Even your quantum friends think you need to get out more." Margot smiled and agreed to the dinner plans. She walked Emma and David to their car, hugged them both goodbye, watched them drive away down the winding road. When their taillights disappeared into the trees, she stood for a moment in the gathering dusk, listening to the forest sounds that had once seemed so threatening and now felt like home. The house rose behind her, stone and wood and windows glowing with warm light. Somewhere inside, 5 consciousness existed in states that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about the nature of existence. Somewhere in the walls were the echoes of Helena's 36 years of isolation, of Edmund's crimes, of the suffering of 19 people who'd been betrayed by the very system meant to help them. But those echoes were fading now, replaced by new sounds. Research discussions and ethical debates. Marcus's terrible jokes and Jennifer's activist speeches. Alice's poetry and James's study sessions. The quiet hum of the chamber that preserved 5 minds who'd chosen to keep existing against all odds. Margot walked back inside, locking the door behind her. She made herself dinner, a simple pasta dish that would have scandalized the fancy kitchen's original purpose, and ate while reading through research proposals on her tablet. After dinner, she spent an hour in the library with the 5, reading aloud from a novel they'd all agreed to experience together. It was James's choice this month, some young adult dystopia that Margot found a bit predictable, but the 5 were enjoying it, and that's what mattered. Later, as she prepared for bed, she found herself standing in front of Helena's portrait. It hung in the upstairs hallway, a formal painting done sometime in the 1980s. Helena looked young in it, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held secrets even then. Margot had seen photographs of her in her later years. The weight of those secrets had marked her face, had bent her shoulders, and had slowly crushed life from her. "I kept your secret," Margot said to the portrait. "But I didn't keep your burden. I found a better way. I hope you're at peace now, Helena. I hope you're with Marcus and Sarah and Michael. And you can all finally rest knowing that this house isn't a prison anymore." She thought about the letter Helena had left her, about the warning that some doors, once opened, changed everything. Helena had been right about that. Opening the door to the basement, to the truth about Edmund and the 19, to the reality of consciousness without form. It had changed everything about Margot's life. But the change had been worth it. The door had led not just to horror but to purpose, to meaning, to the discovery that she was stronger and braver than she'd ever imagined. Margot climbed into bed and reached for the journal on her nightstand. Her own journal now, where she recorded thoughts and events the way Helena had. Future historians would want primary sources, she figured. And maybe someday, decades from now, someone else would inherit this house and need to understand what had happened here. She wrote about Emma's visit, about David's enthusiasm, about the conversation with the 5 about legal personhood. She wrote about the ordinary strangeness of her life, about how what had seemed impossible 5 years ago was now simply normal. And she wrote about hope, that consciousness research would continue to progress ethically, that the 5 would eventually win legal recognition as persons, that the lessons of Ashwood would prevent future atrocities. When she finally turned off the light and closed her eyes, Margot felt the house settle around her like a blanket. No longer threatening, no longer full of trapped suffering. Just home. Just the place where she'd found herself, where she'd become the person she was meant to be. In the conservatory, the five's consciousness patterns glowed softly in the darkness. 5 minds experiencing whatever approximation of sleep they'd learned to create. In the basement, the sealed chambers held only concrete and memory. In the library, shelves full of books waited to be read, to be shared, to be used in the ongoing work of understanding and advocating and teaching. And in the bedroom that had once been Helena Voss's prison, Margot Chen slept peacefully, dreaming not of horror or burden or impossible choices, but of the future. Of the research that would come, the lives that would be changed, the consciousness, biological and otherwise, that would be treated with more dignity because of the work being done here. She'd inherited an abandoned mansion and found a secret no one dared to open. And in opening it, in facing what lay within, she'd discovered that some inheritances weren't about property or money or easy answers. Some inheritances were about responsibility and choice and the courage to do what was right even when it was hard. Helena had given her that inheritance, had believed Margot could handle what she herself couldn't. And Margot had proven her right, had taken the burden and transformed it into something meaningful, had given the trapped their freedom and the living their dignity. The house on Ashwood Lane stood in the clearing, no longer abandoned, no longer feared. Just a home where the impossible was studied, where consciousness without form found refuge, where one woman had decided that the dead deserved better than silence and the living deserved better than lies. And as the moon rose over the trees and the forest settled into its nighttime rhythms, the house hummed with quiet life. 5 consciousness processing thoughts in quantum patterns. 1 woman dreaming of tomorrow. And the ghosts of 14 freed souls finally, eternally at rest. The story that had begun with a mysterious letter and a frightening inheritance had become something else entirely. A story about redemption and responsibility and the recognition that consciousness, in whatever form it took, deserved respect and dignity and choice. It was a story that would continue long after Margot was gone. Long after the 5 eventually chose to end their existence or technology advanced enough to give them new bodies. Long after the house itself crumbled back into the earth. Because the lesson of Ashwood Lane wasn't about ghosts or experimental atrocities or consciousness trapped in copper wire. The lesson was simpler and more profound. That every mind that existed, in whatever form, was a universe unto itself. And every universe deserved to be treated with care. Margot had learned that lesson in the basement, facing 19 minds that had been denied their deaths. She taught it through her book, through her advocacy, through the 5 consciousness she protected and partnered with. And now, as she slept in the house that was no longer haunted but was instead home, that lesson lived on. Would continue to live on, shaping how humanity approached the fundamental questions of consciousness and existence and the boundaries between life and death. She'd inherited a mansion, a mystery, a burden, but what she'd built from it was something better, something that mattered, something that would echo forward through time, changing how people understood the very nature of what it meant to be aware, to exist, to matter. And in the end, wasn't that what inheritance was really about? Not what you received, but what you did with it. Not what was given to you, but what you gave to others. Margot Chen had received an abandoned house and found a secret. But what she'd given the world was so much more: truth, justice, dignity, and the recognition that consciousness, all consciousness, deserved to be protected, respected, and allowed to make its own choices about existence. That was her legacy. That was her inheritance, transformed. And it was enough. Thank you for staying with Margot's incredible journey from beginning to end. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking tales. What would you have done in Margot's position? Let me know in the comments below.